Hidden in a dusty attic for over 50 years lay a letter that would shatter everything the world believed about honor, sacrifice, and war. The envelope bore the faded ink of a young man's trembling hand, words meant to be his last, yet never sent. This was the final confession of Fujio Hayashi, a man condemned to live when he was trained to die. Picture this, a 20-year-old boy, engine roaring beneath him, death's cold breath on his neck, and then nothing. Nothing. Mission aborted, return to base. But what happens to a weapon that refuses to fire? What becomes of a human bullet that never finds its target? The answer will chill you to the bone. In the dying gasps of 1945, as Japan's empire crumbled like ancient parchment, young Fujio Hayashi found himself strapped into humanity's most grotesque invention, a flying tomb designed for one purpose: mutual destruction. The morning mist clung to the airfield like ghostly fingers as he gripped the controls of his Oka aircraft, a mechanical coffin that the Americans would later call a flying bomb. But fate, it seems, had different plans. As storm clouds gathered with almost supernatural timing, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from the horror about to unfold, Hayashi's date with eternity was postponed. The weather turned violent, winds howled their protest, and in a twist that would haunt him forever, his suicide mission became a survival sentence. He taxied back to base, still breathing, still thinking, still human, and that's when the real nightmare began. Imagine walking among the living when you've already made peace with the dead. Imagine the suffocating silence that greets a ghost who forgot to die. In Imperial Japan's twisted logic, survival wasn't victory, it was betrayal. Hayashi had committed the ultimate sin. He had failed to cease existing. But here's what will make your blood run cold. He wasn't alone, and the system that created him was far more sinister than anyone dared imagine. Deep in the war machine's belly, a horrifying truth was taking shape. Japan hadn't just built suicide planes. They had constructed a psychological factory for manufacturing willing corpses. Boys barely old enough to shave were plucked from poetry classes and mathematics lessons, their young minds sculpted like clay into instruments of self-destruction. The process was diabolically simple. Take children, strip away their humanity, replace it with manufactured glory, and watch them march toward oblivion with smiles painted on their faces. These weren't ancient samurai following noble codes. They were teenagers manipulated by a desperate regime that had run out of ammunition and decided to use human souls as bullets instead. The so-called volunteers raised their hands not from courage, but from the paralyzing fear of being branded cowards in front of their peers. One survivor's confession still echoes through history. I volunteered because refusing meant social death, but volunteering meant actual death. We chose the death that came with honor attached. The training was a masterclass in psychological warfare waged against their own youth. They were shown propaganda films of heroic explosions, given ceremonial swords to make them feel like warriors, and taught that surrender was a fate worse than annihilation. But the real letters, the hidden ones, tell a different story entirely. When Hayashi's comrades roared off into their final sunrises and never returned, something inside him shattered. Each empty bunk became a tombstone, each folded uniform a memorial to a boy who would never grow old. The barracks filled with new faces weekly, fresh lambs for the slaughter, their eyes bright with manufactured purpose and genuine terror. He watched this conveyor belt of death with growing horror, realizing he had escaped not just his mission, but his turn in a grotesque lottery where everyone's number eventually came up. The war machine didn't care about victory anymore. It had developed an insatiable appetite for young blood and convinced an entire nation that feeding it was sacred duty. The most devastating revelation? Hayashi began to understand that his willingness to die hadn't been born from belief. It had been manufactured through relentless psychological manipulation. He hadn't been a willing warrior. He had been a successfully programmed victim. Whoa! When Japan's empire finally collapsed in atomic fire and unconditional surrender, Hayashi returned to a homeland that had no place for him. The dead were immortalized in shrines and ceremonies, their sacrifice elevated to myth. But the living, those uncomfortable reminders of a failed ideology, were treated like walking embarrassments. I expected to be celebrated for my willingness to die, Hashi later revealed, his voice barely a whisper. Instead, I was shunned for my failure to disappear. For decades, Japan's museums displayed carefully curated kamikaze letters, sanitized versions that spoke of honor and duty. But when historians finally gained access to the uncensored correspondence, a horrifying truth emerged from the shadows. These weren't the words of eager warriors. They were the desperate confessions of terrified children. "Mother, I am not brave," wrote one pilot. "I do not wish to die, but what choice do I have? If I refuse, what becomes of our family's honor?" Another boy's letter, never meant for public eyes, contained this haunting admission. "They call us lucky to be chosen. I wanted to run, but where could I go? How do you escape from your own country's expectations?" Some pilots wrote multiple farewell letters as their missions were repeatedly delayed. Imagine penning your final words 13 different times, saying goodbye to life over and over again, only to wake up the next morning and have to do it once more. Hayashi's own letter still folded in his pocket when he returned to base read, "To my beloved mother, I depart now as Japan expects. Please find pride in this moment. Forgive me for never becoming the son you deserved." He would carry those undelivered words for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the death he was supposed to die. These letters became ticking time bombs of truth, waiting decades to explode the carefully constructed myth of willing sacrifice. When they finally surfaced, they revealed the kamikaze program's most damning secret. These weren't volunteers. They were victims of history's most sophisticated suicide cult. For 30 years, Hayashi lived in the shadows, haunted by a question that had no answer. Why did fate choose him to survive when so many others perished? Every anniversary of his canceled mission became a day of mourning, not for himself, but for the boys who never got their reprieve from death. Sleep brought no peace. In his dreams, he was forever trapped in that cockpit, diving toward American warships, his heart hammering louder than the engine, only to wake in terror-soaked sheets, grateful for a luxury his friends would never know, the chance to see another dawn. In his private journals, discovered only after his death, Hayashi wrote, "We were told that dying would make us eternal. The cruel irony is that living made us ghosts, invisible, unwanted, forgotten by the very nation we were willing to die for." The 1980s brought a cultural earthquake to Japan. Historians began publishing uncensored documents, survivors broke their decades of silence, and documentaries exposed the manufactured nature of kamikaze mythology. When Hayashi finally agreed to tell his story, his words cut through decades of propaganda like a blade through silk. "They never told us what we were truly dying for," he revealed, his aged hands shaking as he spoke. "We were promised godhood, but those who returned found only ghosthood." His testimony painted a picture far removed from popular imagination. Young men crying themselves to sleep before missions, some attempting to sabotage their own aircraft, others burning letters that revealed too much fear to share with their families. This wasn't the glorious death cult that Japan had mythologized. It was a psychological horror story wrapped in the flag of patriotism. But perhaps most chilling was his revelation about the volunteering process itself. Students were called forward in front of their classmates, knowing that refusal meant public humiliation and family disgrace. Others were simply assigned to kamikaze units without any pretense of choice. The myth of willing sacrifice was exactly that, a myth. Today, as you walk through Japanese war museums, you'll still see the sanitized version of the kamikaze story, smiling pilots, noble letters, displays of ceremonial swords, and rising sun flags. But you won't see the psychological manipulation, the manufactured consent, the uncensored letters soaked in terror and regret. Hayashi spent his final years fighting to change this narrative, appearing in documentaries and giving interviews where he spoke an uncomfortable truth. We weren't heroes flying toward glory. We were children flying toward death because we had been convinced there was no other choice. His last public statement, delivered with a voice that trembled with age and sorrow, contained this haunting confession. "I have carried guilt for decades, not for being willing to die, but for being forced to live. I apologize to those who never returned, not for surviving, but for taking so long to tell their real story. When Fujio Hayashi died, there were no military honors, no ceremonies, no recognition from the government he had served. He passed away quietly, surrounded by the few people who understood the weight of his survival. But his words live on, forcing us to confront a truth that history tried to bury. The photographs of young pilots smiling before their final flights, the letters censored and sanitized for public consumption, the museum displays that celebrate sacrifice while hiding manipulation, all of it crumbles under the weight of one survivor's testimony. In the end, Hayashi's story reveals the most devastating truth of all. They weren't eager to die. They were expertly convinced they had no choice but to disappear. And the only tragedy greater than their deaths was that the world spent decades believing they wanted to die. The letter found in that dusty attic wasn't just Hayashi's unsent farewell, Aka's history's smoking gun, proving that the greatest lie ever told about the kamikaze wasn't that they were cowards, but that they were willing.